You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm your host, Aaron Whiteman, co-director of the Cornell Maple Program at Cornell University. Joining me is my esteemed North Country colleague and co-director, Adam Wild. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Aaron. How are things down on campus?
Well, it's finals week, and Cornell students are especially smart and hardworking, so it's quiet here with everyone buckled down studying for exams. Do you remember what that's like, Adam?
Well, it's been a while since I've been in school, and I did not go to Cornell, but I do still remember staying up late trying to get things to stick in my brain, looking at notes, reading textbooks, and repeating facts over and over in my head. I do really enjoy learning, and I enjoyed school, but it can definitely be hard sometimes.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's a common experience that many people can relate to. Now, you and I also have had the experience of being on the other side of this dynamic as full-time teachers. And in my experience, teaching requires just as much skill and effort as learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember many late nights prepping lessons when I was a professor at SUNY Cobleskill. I probably worked even harder when I was a professor than when I was a student, actually. Teaching can take a lot of effort because you're not just listing off facts for students to memorize. People don't usually learn very well that way. You got to be more creative.
Yeah, my teaching was at the elementary level, but the same is true there. Good teaching requires a lot of skill and experience to design lessons that engage students with the subject. The best teachers I worked with were especially talented people with an ability to draw students into an active learning experience. And this is important to think about as maple producers because education is an important part of our marketing strategy, right?
Yeah, that's so true. Research has actually shown that the average consumer doesn't know much about maple syrup, and many don't even know the difference between the real maple syrup that we make and the imitation syrup that's sold in the grocery stores. Education is an important part of reaching our customers.
Fortunately, for New York sugar makers, the New York State Maple Producers Association has recently hired a uniquely skilled and highly qualified educator to run their maple education program. Adam Henne has been a professor and educator in a variety of settings, including a maple program at a large nature center. And for this episode, I sat down with Adam to talk about the importance of maple education and his plans for the maple education program.
I'm excited to have Adam Henne working in maple education here in New York, but it's going to create confusion now that we have two Adams working in maple education in New York. I keep telling Mr. Henne that he needs to change his name to something different that I was already here, but that aside, I'm really looking forward to your conversation with Mr. Henne, so let's go ahead and have a listen.
Welcome, Sweet Talk listeners. As some of you may know, the New York State Maple Producers Association engages in a wide range of educational activities to promote real maple syrup. Today, I'm very excited to be here with their newly hired maple educator, Adam Henne. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Adam, this is truly exciting. Everyone loves maple. The industry is growing. Public interest is high. There have been rapid advances in technology and markets. And now you arrive on the scene with your very unique and interesting background, which we'll get into in just a moment. But first, can I just ask, you're stepping into a big role. How are you feeling and how's it going so far?
So far, so good. It's been pretty exciting, and I didn't necessarily know what to expect. It was kind of a big change, and there hasn't been somebody in the spot for a little while. And I think the board of directors of the Maple Producers Association had big ideas for new directions this could go. So far, so good, but I think there's going to be a lot more changes coming over time.
Yeah, I've been a part of this process, and I would echo what you said about, you didn't know what to expect. I don't think anyone knows what to expect, but we all have high expectations, I guess.
Uh-oh.
Which is, I guess, puts you in the hot seat. But let's start by talking about you. A little bit about your background and what path led you here to this point in your life.
Yeah, well, it's a long path, so you will have to steer me back on track if I ramble off somewhere. But
just tell us the interesting parts.
the good parts. All right. Well, we're done then. Well, I come from New Hampshire originally, and I've been all over the country doing a few different things. But generally, I describe myself as an environmental educator. That everything I've done in various different capacities through my career has been one way or another has been environmental education. And so I still think of that as the case working with maple education. And I spent 8 years as a professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming. And that was around environmental themes as well. The things that I researched were around sustainable forestry and indigenous territory, Before that, I worked in New York City in a community gardens program and after school program for immigrant youth. And then since I left the university, I've been working for a couple of different nonprofits doing outdoor education, nature education. So I think of the through line that connects all those things is about helping people better understand the way that us human beings relate to the natural world. And so, although some of those things have been pretty different, that's the concept that's kept me motivated throughout. And that's what I'm bringing me into the maple educator job now, too.
Right. And I guess, maple is like one of the ultimate distillations of the human relationship with nature. It's just so unique in that it's a food relationship, it's a stewardship relationship, and it's a case where nature is almost willingly giving us a food. So it's a really interesting perspective for that. So I can see where the nature education role is really valuable in this position.
Yeah, I mean, I love to think of it that way as a gift from the trees, and that we get to have a relationship with the woods to help bring it forth for people. So that's a nice aspect.
Mm-hmm. So you've had all this experience as a nature educator, and at some point that intersected with maple.
Yep. So most recently, before coming here to the Maple Producers Association, I was at the Genesee Country Village and Museum in Mumford, New York, outside of Rochester. And for those who are not familiar with that place, it is a living history museum. So what that means is they have a collection of 68 houses from the 19th century that were brought on site and rebuilt and are interpreted as a historical artifact. The village is recreated, and there are interpreters in period costumes performing what life in rural New York was like in the 19th century, helping people learn about life in the countryside and how our society has changed over time and the kind of technologies that were used and all that stuff. And I ran the nature center for the museum. So I was not in period costume, except very rarely. A couple of times they got me dressed up, but mostly I was in my modern gear running the nature center, where there's a building with exhibits and living animal specimens. And then the museum property is 650 some acres, mostly of woodland. And the village itself is only about 80 acres. And then there's all this other territory. So there's 10 miles of trails, and there's ponds and streams. Awaka Creek runs through there. And so that was all my territory to get to share with people. We had summer camp and scout groups and field trips and all those kinds of different ways that the public could come out and experience New York nature. And as part of that, I learned how to make maple syrup. And that was one of my tasks, running the maple program. So making the maple syrup with the sugar bush that's on site, and then also teaching about maple sugar to the public as part of our regular programming with field trips and with the Maple Festival.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. How big was the sugar bush?
It varied depending on how much we got after it. But the last season, I had 220 trees tapped.
Okay.
On better seasons, we got up to almost 300.
Is this buckets, tubing, combination?
Mostly on tubing. I had a few trees on buckets that were, easy to reach from the path. And then we had some tubing, 5 different sections of tubing set up on gravity. And for a couple of years, had a solar-powered RV battery portable vacuum system set up. So we were sort of experimenting with some of that technology and just finding different ways to produce the syrup that we sold in the gift shop, but also to have some background for sharing with the public when we were teaching about maple sugaring, that there was a hands-on experience that people could have and that our staff could have to share with people as well.
Great. Do you have any idea how many gallons of syrup you produced or what your output was per tap? Because those are the statistics that matter to maple producers, right?
Yeah, it varied so dramatically from one year to another that I don't have an idea what my average was. That first year, that was 6 years ago, season of 2020 was my first maple producing season. And I think I came away with 8 gallons of syrup. It was a pretty poor ratio to start with. And it got better over the years, but it was not great. It was a learning curve that I was still climbing and still climbing at this point. So we certainly did not make as much as we could sell in the gift shop.
Okay. Yep. Well, I think that's an experience that a lot of us maple producers can relate to. There's always a learning curve. We're always on it.
I was fortunate. I began work at the museum in May, so I had a whole year's worth of experience with all the other parts of the programs before getting into maple season. And I got to attend the Cornell Maple Camp in the summer of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was some training before hitting the ground. So I didn't start from zero. And I got a lot of help from other folks there at the museum. My predecessor at the Nature Center, Melissa Marzalek, who helped set up the program and get the sugar house built, and all of the hard work of building a maple production system was all hers. And then she came back to help me get started and learn how to actually work the system while I was there.
Yeah, I bet a lot of our listeners from New York are familiar with the historic village, and it's a really neat place. This is a really cool background that you come from. Let's talk a little bit about the new position now. Your current title is Maple Educator, right?
That's it, yeah.
And do you have kind of an elevator pitch of what your mission is?
Well, I should have a better elevator pitch. A briefer version would be great. But one of the goals of the association is to make sure that all of the people of New York know about the value from New York maple syrup as a food product and as a cultural element, as part of our heritage as New Yorkers and part of sort of our shared cultural experience that brings us together. And so the education program is about education and about outreach and about marketing, about making the whole experience of maple available to all New Yorkers. And so the flagship program of the association's education section has been the mobile maple experience. And listeners might be familiar with the trailer that the association built going back, I think starting in 2019 is when that began.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a mobile rig that can go around to schools and farmers markets and county fairs, and it gets parked at the state fair during those weekends, and is a place where a lot of people may have had the chance to see the Maple Association education program at work, with the simulated evaporator and the simulated sugar bush, and a chance to walk through the maple experience from tree to table. And so that's sort of phase one of education, is reaching the general public. And then it's also been targeted a lot at schools, so it gets built into the curriculum. That's the existing body of what the education program has been doing.
Mm-hmm.
But we have more things in mind. And a lot of the conversations I've had since starting in this field is about like, well, what else can we do? What else can we take?
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's a lot of new ideas. But that's the mission, is to make sure that all New Yorkers have access to knowing about the value and the connection with maple.
Yeah, that's a broad mission. And it's clear that a lot of resources have been invested in maple education and in this position. So maybe a good place to start talking about this is by talking about what value you're bringing for New York maple producers. Can you more explicitly talk about what need you're meeting or what problem you're solving by engaging in this work?
I think there's a few different layers to this. One of them is sort of the most fundamental piece of any kind of marketing thing is that, informing the public about what the product is. And as familiar as everybody in this part of the country is with maple syrup, it's still a regular part of the educational experience that people don't realize what goes into it. And so making sure the public is informed about the costs of production and about the labor and the time and the intensity of what goes into maple sugar production. That's a value proposition for sugar makers, because that's the first question. The first question that consumers have is, why does this product cost so much?
Right.
And that's often the first comment as people are leaving the maple experience is, oh, now I understand why it costs so much. So it's a basic ground level kind of piece of information, but that's a valuable service that, when as sugar makers, we're asking the public to invest in this, what could look like a luxury product, to understand what goes into it and what the labor is and why it's worth that much.
And I think the association just a few years ago did a marketing study where they found that this problem of consumers not being able to tell the difference between real maple syrup and imitation syrups seems to be just so persistent. So the value right there, I mean, that's our main competition in the marketplace. So I see value right there in educating the public about what real maple syrup is and then what goes into the process that makes it more valuable. So that seems like a really good value proposition right there.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental, like, dollars and cents. I think that all of the sugar makers understand that pretty automatically, that that's part of understanding their market. But I think there's some other levels to it as well. Like with any kind of education, we all benefit when society is better informed, when our neighbors better understand what it is that we do and who we are and why we're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
We all get along better. We invest more in each other's situations and supporting each other. And so a general public that understands what sugar makers are dealing with is not just willing to pay the premium cost for buying maple syrup, but maybe is more willing to be supportive of maple as an industry, of our neighbors that are sugar makers, and as fellow New Yorkers. And so it connects to the other missions of the association, which involves lobbying the state government and looking for support for agricultural research and legislative support around maple production and things like that. That is what the association exists to do, the collective bargaining aspect of a trade association. education contributes to that, that if all of the other New Yorkers are informed about who we are and what we're doing, they'll be more supportive in those respects as well. They'll care about legislation that affects maple producers like they care about agriculture in general and the ways that farmers need to be supported by the state.
Right. And that's been definitely an issue recently. There have been issues that come up because maple production kind of falls in between the worlds of agriculture and natural resources. So some of the regulations don't quite fit maple. And so there is definitely need to go to Albany and have public goodwill behind our efforts to get the laws and regulations modified to meet our needs.
Yes, exactly. And so hopefully that's a piece speaking to our legislators and our other elected officials, but also having an informed public, we can help support that. And there's hopefully some synergy between those two things that, speaking to our legislators and knowing that they know that we've been speaking to the rest of New York about this subject and that their constituents are well informed and support efforts to help make life easier for sugar makers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are definitely some good values you're bringing to the table. What kind of tangible benefits do we expect from this type of work? Do you think we're going to see like a direct line to increase sales, or are there intangible benefits as well? Can you just talk more specifically about some of the benefits we'll see from the educational programming you're going to do?
For sure. I think what I hope will be one of the more tangible benefits about some of the expanding that we're hoping to do with the education program is contributing to growing the market for maple syrup. In urban markets and downstate, those are places where people aren't going to a sugar house in March, where they haven't seen the maple trailer come in, where they don't run into sugar makers at the farmer's market. And so they don't have that exposure to what maple sugaring really looks like in a cultural context. So the difference between real and fake syrup is not tangible for them, and they are not as big a market. And that's a place where I think this education program, where we're aiming to try and get that, is doing maple education for whole new audiences, for urban communities, upstate and downstate, and getting downstate at all, ideally, and bringing maple education to schools and public venues in New York City, where most New Yorkers are, and reaching a market that will hopefully be buying syrup everywhere. That's long term, but that's pretty material and pretty straightforward. Another pretty material one is smaller and more local, but I'm counting on volunteers from amongst the sugar makers who might be listening here. When I pull up with the trailer at a school or at a county fair or something like that, I will be teaching children, visitors, about how maple sugar gets made and about the ecology and the chemistry of the process. And we'll be distributing samples of maple syrup. And this is a big part of the educational process, is tasting. That's why people care about it. And it's why kids pay attention, because they know they're getting a sweet treat. And that depends on volunteers to come help with passing out samples and to bring some syrup to share. And then that's also a sales opportunity. Not directly, we don't sell people's maple syrup out of the trailer, but it's a chance for our members to show up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so from so-and-so's maple farm. This is my syrup that you're tasting, and you can get it at these markets. And so we're doing marketing directly while we're educating, as well as the bigger sense of expanding the market.
Well, I think I speak for many maple producers when I say thank you for going to New York City so that we don't have to. That can be a challenge.
We'll see. That's going to be a process, because the maple education program, as it was built around the mobile experience trailer, depends on this trailer, which those of you who have seen it are familiar with. It's a big operation. It's a big piece of equipment, which it has to be to pull up in a parking lot and load a class of 20 students in, where they can stand and see the model evaporator and see the things in it. It's going to be a real challenge getting that into Manhattan. And so that's a project I've undertaken since starting at the association, and we'll be working on going forward, is smaller, more portable versions of maple education, things that I can bring into classrooms where I can't bring the trailer, but I can drive into the city and bring equipment and come to a classroom and show them some of the same things. Or curricular development materials that we can share with teachers at a higher level, teachers in the school district in BOCES units who are developing STEM materials or history curricula. So contributing material that they can then bring into the classrooms. And so in that respect, we'll be collaborating with some other units here in New York State that Cornell has worked with the Ag in the Classroom programs. So that's the angle that I think is going to probably have the biggest impact downstate, is those more flexible, more portable systems. And that I'm really excited about working with some of the other folks who are already in that territory.
Well, that's a really good segue to talking about your plans for the Maple Education program. You've been in education in different capacities before. I've been an elementary school teacher at one point in
Oh,
my
yeah.
life, so I kind of
I don't
understand.
think I knew that. That's cool.
Yeah, Montessori teacher. Yep. And as a teacher, you think a lot about your modalities and how you're going to deliver the content to your audience. So what are some of your plans about the modalities you're going to employ to reach this wide range of audiences you're going to be interacting with?
Yeah, it's a challenge that I'm thinking about a lot because it's a big change from my familiar experience of the past 6 years at the museum, where we were at the sugar house in the woods. And my philosophy and my experience with environmental education is that the biggest barrier is getting children and adults too outside into the woods. And from there, you can line up a whole variety of experiences that will be really educational, that can be really transformational for them once they're outside. Then they can have the physical experience of putting hands on plants, on wildlife, on maple tools, physically connecting with something in the outdoors that's going to affect them, that's going to linger with them and have an effect on how they remember and learn and understand things in a way that classroom experiences don't.
Yeah.
So that was automatic for me in my previous position, and it's not automatic now with the Maple Association. We've got this really cool device, the Maple Trailer, that I can bring places and bring a lot of really cool information and experiences right to schools. So that's going to open up a whole lot more audience. But it's a challenge to make sure that they're getting a similar kind of educational experience when they're not heading into the woods, when they're not out in the actual setting experiencing the natural environment. The upside of how the trailer was designed to be a pretty effective simulation of some parts of that experience. So you're not going into the woods, but you are going to get your hands on some of the equipment that sugar producers use. You're going to get a good physical sense of what maple production looks like in a way that's pretty memorable. And then I think I mentioned it already, and it sounds silly, but like the fact that there's a little jolt of sugar, that people get a sample of syrup, it's really memorable, and kids remember that. I still remember being 6 years old and going to a sugar house in New Hampshire and having sugar on snow. That dopamine jolt really helps fix a core memory for a kid. So we'll be having that. That's going to be a part of every maple education experience that there is sampling maple. But creating a similar kind of physical analog to the experience of going out in the woods is going to be challenging. And so the portable setup that I picture, that I'm hoping to develop to bring to schools where the trailer is not a viable option, what I've done before in similar settings out of the museum is, I've got big plastic totes that I can fill up with maple gear, with the tools, with tubing, with drills, with old-fashioned bit and braces, with a maple stump that I can bolt to a table so that kids can then tap into it, physically experience what it's like to tap a tree, even if it's not a real living tree, buckets that they can carry, and just different ways to try and simulate some of the physical experience. Their bodies are engaged in part of the learning as well as hearing us talk about them.
I think that's so important, having worked with kids, just incorporating movement and a tactile experience in with what they're hearing and seeing. It really reinforces things. It sounds like you have some good strategies for that, and it'll be hopefully really fun to work with those groups. But you have to work with a broader audience too. You're working with the general public, with adults, with maple producers. What are some of your plans for working with those audiences?
Well, I got a couple answers about that. And one is that the easy part is working at the museum has been good preparation for bringing a certain set of material to a shared audience, because generally we would have school field trips where it was big groups of kids. But then there were weekend events, the Maple Festival and things like that, where we get whole families or big groups, big mixed groups coming in. And so I've gotten pretty good at adjusting on the fly to who I'm speaking with. And so being able to talk to small children about, we're putting a hole in the tree and speaking at a basic level. And then when one of the parents asks something about the reverse osmosis machine and what kind of pumps we're using, to be able to adjust tone and content on the fly that way. Mm-hmm. That's a skill that we learn in doing that kind of interpretation to mixed groups. That makes it pretty easy to move into the more mixed audiences at public events like the state fair or other kinds of outreach settings. What's going to be a bigger challenge for me personally is a whole other framework for education that the association has ahead of us, which is education for maple sugar producers. Our work thus far has been about educating the general public, building the market, but there's also a lot of space on bringing educational material to maple producers. And that's where you folks at Cornell have been carrying the enormous burden of doing all of that educational work, all of the extension, bringing the latest technology and the latest best practices to sugar makers. And that's a place where I'm hoping to also step in and be a support That's less familiar because my maple experience as a producer is not as deep as most of the people who are out there doing that work. So am I going to come into it and start telling people how to do their job better? I'm not going to be that guy. But I do think that there's some ways that we can put together events that I can lend a hand in and producing workshops, conferences where sugar makers are coming together and helping bring some of that knowledge, connecting from one producer to another. That's going to be pretty important as time goes on and as there's changes in the funding structures and institutions that are available to provide this kind of knowledge experience. And although my expertise as a sugar maker isn't going to be the most sought after, I think the connections and the opportunities are there.
Yeah, I think part of what's happened is as the industry has grown so rapidly at the same time with all these changes in markets and technology, it's really exceeded everybody's capacity to keep maple producers up to date, including the Cornell Maple Program, because we have all these research questions we're addressing now. And so this partnership between the association and Cornell really makes sense. And then partnering, of course, with our county cooperative extension specialists, I think that gives us a really good network to work from. And part of education, of course, is simply bringing people together so that there can be a transfer of knowledge. We don't all have to be experts. So I think it's really great to have you kind of centrally located in the association to serve as kind of a conduit for that transfer.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to that in any case. Like that's an audience I've loved learning from so far, and I'm looking forward to learning with going forward. I used to say this all the time about the museum, was that it was a great educational institution. I was getting a great education. Hopefully other people were too, but I know I did. And so learning from other sugar makers, it's other people are a tremendous source of knowledge all the time.
Like all forms of agriculture, maple producers, I think, are really good at teaching each other because we're independent spirits, right? As farmers, we like to do our own thing, but we like to learn from each other too. So that's great. Just kind of switching gears here a little bit. Educational marketing, it goes beyond just familiarizing them with the product. There's also this rich story and cultural history that comes along with maple that is a big part of the value. And your background is in anthropology. So can we just geek out on that for a minute? I'm sure you've thought about that. What is so special about maple syrup in the cultural memory or whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, everyone that is already consuming maple syrup, they're doing it not just because it's sugar or because it's flavor. It is a flavor amongst many others, and they have an infinite range of options. That's how we do things now. But it has all sorts of associations. It's a valued flavor and a valued food product because it connects to memory and it connects to childhood and it connects to associations with rural life and with forests as they are themselves, not just a place where we get a product from, but as a place to be. And so even if you're not going into the woods at all, even if you haven't, even if you bought your maple syrup at Wegmans, you're still, some part of you as a consumer is triggered by those kind of things and is interested in that. That's a cultural value. That's part of something that we learned that motivates us, even subconsciously, what choices we make and what value we get from a thing. It's not just calories, it's not just sucrose, it's engagement of your whole senses and thought and experience. And I do, as an anthropologist, I find that exciting to think about. Part of what we're doing when we make something and sell it to people is connecting them with the whole set of rural experiences and a set of historic experiences. That's something I'm really grateful for the chance to have worked at the History Museum and gotten to share that really materially. But it's there for sugar makers, whether or not they are wearing 19th century costumes and bringing out wooden buckets and things like that. That history of how maple syrup came to be on our tables is relevant to consumers. And sometimes they know it and sometimes they don't, but I think it's part of their experience either way. And so it's a piece of, how our country developed, a piece of our history in some really interesting ways. And it's a chance to talk about how natural resources influence society's development and how our technologies influence how we use natural resources and how that affects our social development. All those things go into the story of pouring some syrup on your pancake. The fact that it's a product that derives from Native American knowledge is really interesting that way. And that's one of the widely shared pieces of knowledge. Everyone that I've spoken to so far about maple syrup already knows, well, we got this from the Native Americans. And that's kind of cool. That's actually pretty rare that would be the case. Our society in general does not value Native American heritage, well, or at least is not informed about it very well. But people know that maple syrup came from Native Americans. And that's, I think, a great starting point for lots of interesting things.
Yeah, I was going to break in and drill down on that issue, but I think you put your finger on it. Like, there's a lot that people are unaware of with Native American culture. There's definitely a divide between our culture and our indigenous people. And it seems like maple syrup might be a way to bridge that divide and build a better relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful product that people value and appreciate, and when they think of it in that context, that adds something for everyone and a chance to value that historical connection that they haven't necessarily thought about elsewhere. And there's a lot of really cool educational opportunities there too in talking about the technology, because the ways that we are currently making maple syrup are very different than the ways that natives were making maple products before European contact. And so to be able to compare them, to talk about how and why those technologies changed, that's something that I always like, I guess, as an anthropologist or as an educator. Why are people doing these things differently? Why are we using this tool instead of that tool? This was my theme as an anthropologist all along, was that the way that we human beings experience the natural world, it happens in a social and cultural context. And so the way that we as modern industrial consumers are consuming maple syrup, that happens in that industrial and that capitalist context. And we get a product that we're often kind of alienated from. We buy it at the store, we don't see how it gets made. And people in a different era, Native Americans before colonization, they were producing a product in an extremely different cultural and economic and political setting. But by learning about it, by sharing the production methods historically and contemporary, we can sort of chip through that a little bit and let consumers, even if they're just buying the product at Wegmans, let them get a little picture, a deeper picture of how something is made and how that connects them to the forest that gave it to us to begin with.
So one of my thoughts when you were saying that one of the values of maple is this shared cultural experience, memories of childhood and things like that, I was going to offer the counterpoint that a lot of the people that experienced that in their childhood have moved on and there's less connection to that. But I think what you're saying really gets at the value in our current situation, with AI and all this advancement technologically in the world and the kind of separation of people, the kind of isolation as technology kind of takes over, where personal interconnection to nature and other people used to be. Do you think that's an opportunity for maple to come in as people start feeling that need and saying, what are my roots in this world? Is that a chance for maple producers to say, reconnect with this tradition and your community and come out and experience this?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that's part of why we do things like the Maple Weekends. The product is just another sweetener in some ways. But when someone chooses to buy maple syrup, they are at least potentially buying into making that connection with their past, with the natural world, and with all of us who are producing that. And you can make that really explicit with things like the Maple Weekends and with the educational experiences that we can provide with the association, letting people know, see the whole path of how the product gets to them and see the labor and see the ecosystem that produces it. That veil of commodity fetishism can be lifted away a little bit, and that commodity becomes something that's alive still. Even if they're buying it at Wegmans, they can still access some of that, and we can help them do that with some of those educational resources.
There certainly seems to be a drive for people to reconnect with the real world. And I can certainly relate to that. And maple's just so exciting. People love to get out and do it. So this is all wonderful. I'm really excited for you, Adam. I'm excited to see what you do with this position. And I'm also looking forward to seeing you out there on the road.
Yeah, I'm going to be getting on the road soon. We're scheduling trailer expeditions for the spring right now. I think we want to wait and get the trailer on the road when there's not quite as much ice and things like that. But I will be out at the January conference's Catskills, going to be trying to make it out to some of the association's regional membership meetings and things like that during the winter, the icier parts of the year. And if anybody needs a hand in the sugar bush for a day or two, when I can't get the trailer on the road, drop me a line at mapleexperience@nysmaple.com, and maybe I can come out and learn a little something from you in person.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. I hope you get some calls. I'm sure there are some folks that could use a hand in the sugar bush. Maybe you can come down and help us at Cornell.
Yeah, I would really like that.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for your time. And thanks, folks, for tuning in and listening.
Thank you, Aaron.
Well, Adam, what do you think? Is maple education in good hands?
Yeah, for sure, Aaron. I've been a big supporter of maple education across New York, and I worked a lot with Christina Farrar, who was the previous educator in this position. She did a lot of work to build this program around the mobile maple experience trailer. So it's great to see Adam Henne come in and build on that foundation with new programming and get the mobile maple trailer back out on the road.
Christina certainly deserves a lot of credit for her work getting this program off the ground. And she also had a lot of great help from association members and many other volunteers who've contributed to this program. So it's exciting to see this next evolution of the program under Adam Henne.
Yeah, and one thing I'm really looking forward to is how Adam Henne's going to kind of expand outside of the trailer to classrooms, especially in heavy urban or even suburban areas where it's harder to get the mobile maple trailer in, where, going into classrooms more and bringing some of these hands-on activities. I think that's exciting. And especially when the trailer wasn't able to go out on the road in the wintertime, when it's a good time to be thinking about maple, to get into those classrooms and educate those students. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, the mobile maple experience is a great tool. And if our listeners aren't familiar with it, it's essentially a large simulated sugar bush inside of a trailer. But like you said, there's a lot of unmet need for consumer education out there. And it's going to take more than just the trailer. It's going to take a lot of modalities and a lot of different kinds of effort to reach all those audiences. So it's great that Adam's expanding different types of programming that he's going to offer. So listeners, keep an eye out for Adam Henne's work in New York, and hopefully we'll have him on the show again. And remember, if you have questions or comments about this episode or anything related to maple, you can reach us through the contact form at www.cornellmaple.com.
And you can catch us again next month for another episode of Sweet Talk, All Things Maple. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, All Things Maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.